Welcome to what I wanted to just offer all of you, which is a free preview of my new book, Unlocking the Heart, which is out next month. It comes out on October 8th, I believe. And I'm so excited to share it with the world. It's been about 10 years, a 10-year work in progress. And I really started it from workshops that I offered, possibly with some of you who are out there right now, and really just got this idea to bring in poems of my own, use those as jumping off points or prompts for writing. And then I also ended up including some just deeper reflections on the poems. You know, we read poems out in the world and we often don't know where they come from or what occasioned them. And I'm also going to be sharing a little bit from my friend Mark Nepo's new book, You Don't Have to Do It Alone, The Power of Friendship, which I highly recommend to everyone. It's a book filled with a lot of warmth and tenderness. And part of the reason I love doing programs with Mark and wanted to share his book with all of you and wanted to share him with all of you, though he can't be here today with us because of some medical issues, is that he has been really integral in my own kind of process of becoming a poet. I read Mark Nepo almost every single morning because he makes these really large metaphorical leaps and these kind of deeper soul dives into what it means to be alive. And I just find that that really ignites my own inspiration. And a lot of what he says just gets me thinking, gets me writing, makes me want to write an essay or journal. And so I just love sharing his work. I always recommend his books. This new one is great. If you don't have it, the Book of Soul is amazing. The Book of Awakening, also likewise, very amazing. And highly recommend that one as well. I want to start though with a poem of my own. And this one, I wanted to begin with this one because I directly remember where I was when I wrote this. And I was reading Mark Nepo's book, The Book of Awakening. And he spoke about this idea that we have this human part of us and this being part of us. So, whatever we call that being part, the spirit, the soul, there are so many different names for it. But there's this deeper part of us. And I had never thought of it in those terms that we are a marriage of the human, having to do everyday tasks and chores and, feel love, anger, disappointment, grief, the whole spectrum of emotions. But there's this deeper, maybe more eternal part of us that when we can slip into that, we just feel better. We feel like we can take a deeper breath. And so this poem is called Human Being. And this is again from Unlocking the Heart. The human part of us wants and needs and breaks, but the being part sees beyond the body's aching joints and joyful noises to the open road ahead. The gravel is covered in a fine layer of snow and ice with the white sun shining through a tunnel of pines like the unblinking eye of the source. The human part of us knows that if we keep going, we will slip and slide and fall down endlessly. But the being part says, so what? And pushes us onward toward the light, since it knows there is no way but to move forward, step by step, in our heavy boots. And I'm struck that that poem takes up another common theme of Mark Nepo's, which is another title of his books, one of his books, Falling Down and Getting Up. So he sometimes hosts webinars and programs with that title. And I think that is the human experience, right? It's the experience of falling down, getting up again. When we've fallen down, hopefully finding the courage and support we need to lift ourselves back up, to accept that help from other people when they are available as well. And that really is the theme of Mark's new book, You Don't Have to Do It Alone. Seeking support, solace, the open hand of other people, um, and giving ourselves to those other people, but also not giving too much. So, how we meet each other on this spiritual path of friendship and love without giving too much of ourselves, so much that we are burned out or that we don't have anything left to give ourselves or anybody else. I know what this is like having been a caregiver for both of my parents who died quite young. And I know there are probably caregivers among all of you out there. It is a very heroic act to give so much of yourself, and it's very difficult to balance, strike that balance between the giving, the offering of energy, and and the receiving of it from other people, and any sort of compassion that we can give ourselves to. So Mark speaks to this in his book. This is on page 12 if you have a copy already. But he says, learning how to love another without giving yourself away is a lifelong challenge. For it takes quiet courage to stay loving and to stand by your core. Over the years, I've learned that when I can stay close to what my heart knows to be true, all manner of love will unfold in time. I've also learned that being fully alive requires both finding trusted others as well as being a trusted other. For trusting and being trusted allow us to blossom. His prose is like a poem in and of itself. And he has said in an interview that I did with him that he doesn't necessarily think of his prose and his poetry because he is also very much a poet. He doesn't think of these two things as separate. And that was really helpful to me because I love to write essays, I love to write prose and journal. And I think it's so nice and helpful to think of those things as inextricably linked, that for him, everything is poetry. The whole spectrum of his writing encompasses poetry. And he said his publishers just decide to call it other things, which I love too. Because once publishers get involved, everything changes in terms of how a book is titled or packaged. But the essence of his work is still so much the same. And one of the things I really appreciate about this new book, too, is the way that he talks about famous friendships among writers, among artists, and spiritual teachers. And he also talks about very personally about his own friendships, his relationship with his wife, Susan, and his relationship to the animal world. Mark is a big dog lover. And so that's a big part of this book. And he includes a poem that he wrote about what he calls his dog child, Mira, that I think is just gorgeous. And I'm sure there are so many of us out there who are dog and animal lovers who can relate to this. If you're not a dog lover, you're certainly a cat lover, perhaps. And so this can apply to you as well. This one is on page 127 if you want to follow along. And this one is called The Deeper Chance. Mira is our dog child, and though we held her as a pup, she has a need to be held that comes from beyond us. Though I sat with her when she was the size of a loaf of bread, sat on the kitchen floor staring softly into her eyes. She has a need to stare that comes from a place beneath the awkwardness of humans. These days, she seems a furry, naked thing that never looks away. Now I understand. God made the animals as raw, breathing elements, each closer in their way to one aspect of being. And that the friction of time on earth might have its chance to make us wise, God made the animals speechless. We've learned that mira in Spanish means to look, and lately she licks us awake and stares deep into us, as if to say, get up, don't look away, admit you need to be held. I can hear Mark reading that for those of you who know him and his work. He's such a good reader of his poems. And, I love that idea of having a need to be held that comes from beyond Mark and his wife, beyond the immediate, that she seems to need something deeper than um, than what is present between them. And then also that idea that her need to stare comes from a place beneath the awkwardness of humans. I love that too. I think we all carry some bit of that, Mira's tendency to stare off when we're looking off into the middle distance or thinking deeply about something or really feeling a moment deeply, looking off like that. There's a place that we're staring out from that is beneath all of our awkwardness, all of our emotions, and the messiness of being alive and human that I think is much, much deeper. And I almost don't want to put it into words or try to explain it, but it is a really beautiful thing. And I think that's what I love about poetry is that you don't have to explain it. You can just do as Mark does, and share this gorgeous language that comes alive when you read it. So I'll just share another tidbit from You Don't Have to Be Alone, and then I'll move into sharing from my new book as well. But this one is about friendship, and yeah, I think it really speaks for itself. This one is on page 59. So Mark says, my oldest friends have come into my life in the most ordinary ways, meeting in a cafe, sitting next to each other on a train, listening to each other's grief on a park bench, or while helping a common friend. Meeting, sitting, listening, and helping are the resources that let us find the extraordinary in the ordinary. I just want to read that again. Meeting, sitting, listening, and helping are the resources that let us find the extraordinary in the ordinary. These practices allow us to discover the friend that waits in every stranger. So again, I love that line, the friend that waits in every stranger. And I know that's hard to put into practice sometimes, when we're moving through the world and maybe someone seems like they're not being polite or, even being what we would call openly rude. Um, to see that there is a friend waiting in someone who might seem cold at first or who might be in a pain of their own, I think really argues for approaching the world with greater openness, greater kindness, and just maybe reminding ourselves as we move through the world that there is a friend waiting in every stranger. There is a friend maybe waiting in people we know we don't get along with who are not strangers and who we know we don't get along with, like family, coworkers, you name it. Those friends might be waiting in there. They might not, but I love that Mark is keeping that possibility open for all of us and maybe asking us to be more aspirational. So that was, just hold it up again, the lovely purple color. You don't have to be alone, the power of friendship. And now I'm going to share a little bit from Unlocking the Heart. And I'll share the cover again too. But I also wanted to just share with you how gorgeous the interior is. There are full color illustrations throughout this book, and I just feel so honored that my publisher was able to do that because poetry doesn't always get a lot of love out in the world. Maybe you noticed that, those of you who are poets or just read poetry, we think of poetry as this other thing. But I love when it's kind of uplifted and it's placed on a pedestal all its own. I So, as I mentioned, there are poems, there are little reflections, essays that come after the poems, and then prompts for your own writing. So, if you do get a hold of this book, I recommend reading it with a notebook or a journal of your own, just keeping something nearby because I love to write poems that actually open the door for other people. And I think that's why I chose to call this Unlocking the Heart, because I've just noticed over the years that even though I wasn't trying to do this in the beginning, when I started bringing those poems into workshops and sharing them with other people as ways of going deeper into their heart, their spirit, their own writing, it really unlocked something. There was a word or a phrase or an image or just the poem itself unlocked something for those people. And I sort of realized that's what I love doing, and that's my intention for writing poetry, essay, anything. But the poems, especially because they happen pretty quickly, they can drill down much more deeply into a moment. And I think we can receive them and let them settle in us. And it's almost like they have just enough truth for us to digest in those few moments that it makes it harder to do when you're writing prose or when you're reading it out loud. So, this next poem I'm going to share, I've been thinking a lot about burnout because, whether we are emotionally burned out from caregiving, like I mentioned, or just from the last few years, COVID was such a hard time. So many of us have gone through losses. And I know my tendency, just because of who I am, is to try to stay busy and useful during a crisis or during a difficult time. And it certainly happened. I lost my mother almost 2 years ago now, very suddenly. And after she died, I wasn't consciously doing this, but I realized that I was trying to stay busy as a way of managing the grief or not fully feeling the grief. And I wrote this poem on the heels of that time, realizing that I didn't want to feel anything else but the grief. I actually wanted to feel the grief, which also allowed me to feel the joy sometimes or the delight that might come along with it. So, by no longer denying the grief with busyness and work, I was able to open the door for other emotions as well, and really unexpected emotions, I would say. But this poem is really about coming back to yourself, coming back to self care, and it is called After Burnout. You finally decide to do no more than is necessary, relishing each new gulp of air drawn into your lungs. When out of the flavorless mush of days, even weeks without sun, it happens again. Life calls you back. With a hint of chocolate in the cup of coffee taken alone at the table, or the needles of coneflower seeds sticking to your fingertips as you spread them around the autumn earth. How all living things want to go on, attaching themselves to whatever body or breath of wind will carry them home. Now stop in the driveway and listen as amber gold leaves, one by one, break off with a simple snap of stem from branch. That sound just shy of silence, saying to you, it's time to release all the relentless reaching for the light. Rest is not death, though it may feel like it at first. And the invitation for writing and reflection, if any of you out there want to do some writing of your own, is just to write about a time when you also felt really burned out and you decided to make some kind of change, even if it was just sitting for 5 minutes with a cup of tea or sitting out in the sun in the backyard or in a park. And, you might write about what led to this feeling of burnout and how did you embrace a new way of being in the face of stress and anxiety? How did you say yes um, to just being fully with it all in the midst of that burnout? So that's one invitation that you might carry with you. And this next one really came out of a similar time as that poem. It is sort of about burnout. And it's about coming back to, I think, the pleasures of daily life, domestic life. I really love writing about my life at home with my husband. I am quite a homebody. Um, don't really like to go too far from home, even though I enjoy travel, really love it. I also love the routines of home that can start to feel very sacred after a while. And I was doing a reading a few years ago with Naomi Shihab Nye, one of my favorite poets, and she said she never uses the word busy. So she has completely banished it from her vocabulary, never likes to use it. If she says, I have too much going on, she says that, I have too much going on, or she says, life is full, my day is too full, something like that. But she doesn't like to use the word busy. And so I began to meditate, like, well, why doesn't Naomi use this word? It's such a common word. And I think it's because we often fall back on it, you know, and the more we tell ourselves the story that we are busy, that we have too much to do, um, maybe the more it feels that way and the more overwhelmed we can feel. And I sort of decided I want to live like Naomi. I don't want to have that word busy always, kind of in my mouth, ready to say when I have a lot going on. So this poem is about my attempt also to banish the word busy from my vocabulary. This is called One Word I Don't Need. I am banishing the word busy from my mind, like picking stones from the lentils I have just washed in the colander. Is there an uglier word than busy, with its two hurried syllables and hard consonants rushing out of the mouth, used mostly as an excuse not to be where I am right now, which is leaning over the sink and letting lentils slide through my fingers, feeling their smoothness as I soften into the minutes. No longer seeing this as a task, but simply imagining what it will be like later to savor the lentils after they've simmered for hours with roasted tomatoes, cumin, and coconut milk. When we ladle them into waiting bowls and silence our phones, laying them both face down on the table. So that ending felt really sudden to me. I think there were a few more lines when I first wrote it, um, but I loved that gesture of silencing the phones, and not just silencing the phones, but placing them face down on the table so that we can't be distracted. So that if someone texts, someone calls, we don't know. The phones are on silent. We're just having this meal together. And it felt like a kind of reclaiming of just the space of being with my husband, being in my own life, and something that I would normally dread, which is like picking stones out of lentils or picking stones out of rice. I could just stop and say, wow, these lentils feel really smooth as they're running through my fingers. And they feel good. This I'm actually enjoying this task a little bit, like trying to find every little stone. And I just think when we give ourselves permission to do those small things and to have that little bit of space, we start working this muscle of self-compassion and deeper presence in the world. And I know that's often when my own poems come to me, out of those spacious times when I've given myself permission to do that. And I'm not just rushing through things, right? Which we so often do, which I admit I was probably doing earlier today, rushing from room to room, getting things ready before I hopped on here with all of you. But but now I'm here and we're all just breathing together. And I'll also share the invitation for that one. And I really love this one actually, and people do end up writing from this one quite a bit. So the invitation for writing and reflection is there some task or chore that you secretly love doing and that brings you into a more settled and centered space? Describe it in every delicious detail, relishing all of the sensory images. So, really going into all the senses, you might just like maybe you love doing the dishes, which is not something I love doing at all, I can promise you. But maybe you secretly love that. And so you can describe the sponge or the dishcloth, the suds of the soap, how the soap smells. I think mindfulness is this word that is sometimes a little overused nowadays, but we don't have a better word for that kind of deeper presence. We kind of want to call that mindful when the whole body becomes this kind of sensing mind, and we can just appreciate all the little things, all the physical pleasures that are around us. All right. So I'll read just a few more. And then if anybody has any questions at all, um, please feel free to pop those into the Q&A. And I just saw one from Deborah. Hi, Deborah. Good to see you here. And she said she would love to hear more about Mark Nepo's influence on your writing, certainly the spiritual, but what about craft? The funny thing is, I'll just address this before I go into the next one. The funny thing about Mark Nepo's influence on my work, I think, is he helped to show me that the spiritual can be part of the craft in a way, and also that I could write about everyday things from my life in a way that sort of elevates them to the sacred, but also allows them to be very simple at the same time. So he writes in a very accessible, simple way, but he's also not afraid to, um, for lack of a better phrase, go larger, kind of stretch out what he says into this more universal statement. So, what he was saying about his dog Mira, for instance, her stare beneath, in a place that's beneath the awkwardness of humans. Her need to be held is coming from someplace farther away from what's right here. So, kind of going universal and then bringing it right back down to the specific, being deeply feeling, being open-hearted in the writing. I didn't really know that you were allowed to do that before reading Mark Nepo, whether in essays or in poetry, because he was one of the first spiritual writers that I really came across, and I loved how he approached philosophy, spiritual practice from a poet's perspective. So, in other words, kind of living what Naomi Shihab Nye has also said, that your life is the poem. So, the poem that you're trying to write doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can just be from the materials of everyday life. And that was one of the things that he taught me the most. And I think also how to how to be unashamed and unabashed about being a deeply feeling, open-hearted writer. Um, Another poet who does that is Rosemary Watola Tromer. I think of her poetry as very deeply spiritual, and poetry for her is almost a kind of daily spiritual practice. And she writes about everyday things, writes about being in the garden, writes about driving her daughter to the airport and being afraid that she's about to get on this plane to Guatemala. So these are two people who have influenced my own writing so much in terms of the spiritual as well as the craft, because I think when we see how someone else writes about everyday life, it gives us permission to do the same, to write about it, or if we're not writers, to just really appreciate it. That this life here and all of its messiness and dustiness and dirtiness, it also is worthy of a kind of worship. And I think that's really important. So, next poem, and then I'll take a few more questions after the next few poems as well. And so, this next one is called When Fear Takes Over. It is very much about um, bringing more compassion toward ourselves. I try to be very open about the fact that in spite of my calm voice and my demeanor, I am actually a pretty fearful, anxious person. Just ask my husband. He will tell you. And so I've had to develop these ways of, kind of comforting myself with the help of other spiritual practitioners, meditation, a good therapist, and poetry itself often points to the practices that I need the most to just calm myself, bring myself back to center. And sometimes, if my mind is really swirling, picking up a book of poems, reading poems by other people, or just sitting down and writing a poem or writing whatever comes to me, I find that it somehow grounds me because poetry ultimately, for the most part, is grounded in our actual world. And so when the mind is spinning out, I kind of need something to bring me back. So this poem is about one of those practices. It's called When Fear Takes Over. Never underestimate the power of your own gentle hand when placed over a racing heart, that press of flesh to flesh which says, yes, you will make it through this. Walk alone in the snowy woods and listen for the way trees speak to each other in winter, rubbing bare limbs together. Reach out to a friend, let their voice be the lullaby you never heard as a child. Let kind words wrap around you like a blanket so thick it soaks up the sound of every secret worry spoken to the air. And I love that they have actually done studies now which prove that a hand over your heart, especially a hand really touching the bare chest, that press of flesh to flesh, can instantly calm you in the same way that holding the hand of someone else that you trust can really calm you down. And so the invitation for this one, very similar to some of the others, you might write a kind of instructional poem for yourself. So, what calms you down? What have you done in the past when you've been in the midst of fear and anxiety? I love writing instructional poems because they're such great reminders to myself of what to do when I get lost in fear and anxiety. So, again, it kind of strengthens that muscle of being present to the emotion and then responding in maybe a healthier way. But I think other people find it useful too, because even if I'm speaking to myself in this kind of instructional voice, just as I did with this poem, other people realize like, it's like listening in on a conversation someone is having with themselves. So it's this moment of kind of deep intimacy where you're getting to hear how someone else might speak to themselves in this gentler, more tender way. Thich Nhat Hanh sometimes talks about treating ourselves as honored guests. We have a guest in our home. We might say, oh, do you need some water? You look tired. Why don't you sit down? Let me make you something to eat. Can you imagine if we spoke to ourselves and treated ourselves in that same way, like we were a guest in our own home? I just think the world would be very different if we could do that. So, just a couple more poems, and then I'll get to some of your questions. This next poem, I don't always remember where I wrote my poems, but I remember the very moment that this poem came to me, and I talk about this in the little essay afterwards. Came to me when I was driving to work. I used to have to commute about an hour from Vermont to Albany, New York, where I taught. And it was kind of a miserable drive because it was really long. Often there was traffic. And I enjoy Albany, New York, but having to do it multiple times a week, not usually not every day, luckily, but multiple times a week, just felt really tiresome. And so I was really tired this day. I was feeling kind of hopeless. And then something happened, which the poem talks about. And I realized that, I never really thought about that phrase losing heart or what that meant, and then what it would feel like to regain heart. So when you can feel the heart again, when you feel more in touch with life and the world, I'm really interested in these moments when we come back from difficulty or we come out of fear, anxiety, grief, even if it's a little glimmer of something that brings us out. Sometimes that's just so necessary, so important. And I really love lifting up those little glimmers as well. So this poem is called Losing Heart, written on the highway to Albany, New York. That's my edition. That's not the title. Losing Heart. It's not like misplacing the car keys or forgetting your mother's address. You know it's impossible to actually lose the heart working so hard in the chest, resting for only the slimmest of instants between beats. Yet you wake some days patting empty pockets, digging through every drawer in the house, searching under the bed and couch. In the space of a night, the hope that burned bright, flowing like a medicine in your veins, can drain from the body, leaving you bereft in bed and getting up only to bathe yourself in the sickly light of the fridge, the glow of screens. But you can trust that the heart never goes far, never abandons you for longer than you can handle. You might be driving to work one stormy morning, scowling at every car that passes you when it happens again. That sudden leap in the chest as you see the rain slick blacktop shining blue in places where it gives back the sky. And then you're anchored again in that faithful rhythm by which you can love the world. So, the invitation for this one is to maybe think about a time, probably not too hard to think about or remember, when you lost heart, when maybe you were feeling really kind of down in your heart, as some people say, and some little bit of beauty, some little glimmer, as I like to call it, just drew you out of that. Even if the disappointment, fear, anger, whatever it was, came back, even if you were scowling at every car that passed by 5 minutes later, maybe you had that 5 minutes of bliss when like when I saw that bit of blue reflected from the sky, it was just like, oh, the world is miraculous. Like I'm driving on this blacktop that has turned blue because of all the puddles from the rain. It's reflecting the sky with this little bit of light overhead. Um, yeah, it made the drive all that much better. And I think when we have these little openings and we can capture them, we can write about them, makes life a lot fuller as well. Okay, I will read one more poem and then get to some of your questions. And let's see. This is one I don't read very much, and I also remember writing this too. This was written really before I started meditation. I'm kind of a reluctant spiritual practitioner, so I often felt kind of cheesy talking about meditation or prayer or going to a church or a Buddhist temple. I've let go of all of that right now in my life. I just do not care anymore. I am unabashedly spiritual. I just am who I am. But this was before that happened, and I saw this group of people. I think it was just after they had done yoga together, or maybe no, I think it was a meditation class, and they were just sitting in a circle, and they looked so peaceful, so blissful, and I just thought, I want some of that. And so, of course, I went home and wrote a poem, which was my form of peace and bliss. Um, and so this one is called Meditation Class. So obviously it was a meditation class. I paused in the rain outside the storefront, though there was no sign, only the image of a lotus on the steamed over window. Inside, rows of people crouched on cushions, eyes closed, their legs folded beneath them. Some were mouthing what I took to be a mantra, a few words in Sanskrit meant to make them hum as one with the universe. I wiped the fog from the glass and saw a statue of the Buddha on a shelf, laughing at himself, laughing at me, standing there in a puddle under a pine tree that kept dripping on my head, keeping perfect time with my heartbeat. The night seemed to slow the longer I watched those students going nowhere and doing nothing together until there were no more worries about the rent, no sick parents or ex boyfriends, only a car passing by on the slick street, the sound of something being torn in two. And there are these small moments that are kind of turning points in your life. And I am not always aware of them, but I think, again, coming back to that idea of the writing as holding these moments for us has been so important for me because otherwise, I'm not sure I would have remembered walking by that meditation class and seeing those people that are still so alive for me, um, just sitting together, um, sitting in peace. So Darlene is asking, why did it take me 10 years to write this book? I'll address that question first, and then she has another one. Um, so it took 10 years because probably I needed to build up the courage to actually put together a book that was so openly spiritual, that was about mindfulness, self-compassion, courage, that was about being present to the small moments of stillness and calm in our lives. Because I was trained as an academic, basically, so I thought I would go on, teaching in universities and would never be publishing books like this. But my life has luckily led me to this point of having a much wider view of poetry and casting a much wider net than just universities. And so it took a while to get past some of that. And my poems take a long time to write. And I think writing about the poems in prose, creating those exercises, it was a long time before I realized this really wanted to be a book. I was kind of collecting them and gathering them to use in different classes. But it took a while to realize, oh, wait, I want this to be a book. I want to share this with more people than just the people in my workshops. Or, I have a weekly email totally free that I send out with one of my own poems, a reflection, and a writing prompt. And I realized that I could pull those and, add to those, revise those, and those could be entries of their own in a book. And so it just took some time to get there and to kind of cull through and decide which ones were the best ones. And Darlene also asks, should I let my family read my poetry that I want to publish? Looking for advice about readability, but not sure if it's the right way to go. That's a tough one, Darlene. I think you could try it out, but also know that your family may not be the best judge. They might be somewhat biased. Who knows? Hopefully, your family is very loving and supportive. Um, but I find it's more useful to have, even if it's just one or two other people or a small circle of trusted folks with whom you can share your poems. Oftentimes, you can find those people at libraries, have, small group workshops. You can find those online. Um, because really what we need, I think, is some courage and encouragement when we're writing. I need that even now. So my husband is one of my trusted readers, but it's taken us a while to get there because he has said some things that actually upset me and offended me in the past just because I misunderstood what he was trying to say. So I guess that's my only warning is that there may be some negotiation as you share things with your family. And and Anne Mohundro is asking to um, share the names of the poets. I will put those in the chat here. So it's Naomi Shihab Nye and Rosemary Watola Tromer. And hopefully you can see that in the chat. But I'll send those out in the follow-up email too. And Elizabeth Cassidy is asking, has anyone ever written a poem about sweeping up cat litter? And that's what makes me stop and just be in the moment. I love your practice and what you're saying about that. I bet there are poems about picking up kitty litter and sweeping it up from the floor since it gets everywhere. But you could write that poem too. I invite you to do that. What does it feel like? What do you think about while you're sweeping up the kitty litter? Ziggy asks, how is your writing going in response to our current political election cycle? Oh my goodness. Good question. I do not, all poetry, I think, is political. I tend not to write as much about what's happening in the moment because I think it's harder sometimes for poetry to address that. But that being said, I read this article about Kamala Harris and her campaign, and it was in the New York Times, but it was sort of critical and saying, joy is not a strategy. And so I wrote this poem recently, and I said, I want to title it Joy is the Only Strategy, because I actually think that joy is a strategy for living. It's a strategy for everything. And if we follow our joy, instead of just trying to win or trying to create some version of whatever success might be for ourselves, I think we're all going to be happier people. And I've always tried to follow my joy in my life. And the times when I didn't, or when I felt like I was led astray, and that goes with my writing practice too. So I try to follow the joy, even if it's, taking joy in addressing my grief or my disappointment or some other difficult emotion. There's joy in getting it out, so I just try to follow my joy when it comes to all that. Um, Lana Ayers, who has a beautiful new book of her own called The Autobiography of Rain, highly recommend. She asks, how do you manage the self and the other, the greater spiritual truth, so beautifully in your work? There's always too much I in my poems. Um, Gosh, I can relate to that as well. I often feel like there is too much I, but I actually think you're putting it really well that oftentimes writing for me is a going back and forth between the I and the other larger truth, or asking some large question and then coming back to the specific, coming back to the daily, the ordinary life that we're all leading. So I think of it sometimes as, I'm not a filmmaker, but, a camera will come really close up and then we'll kind of pan out. So I think of that motion sometimes when I'm writing a poem because for whatever reason, oftentimes I want to start with the larger truth or a larger kind of statement, almost like a mathematical proof that then the poem tries to prove with the so-called evidence that I'm creating. The evidence is just the images, the specific experience or moment that I'm describing. And so maybe it's helpful to think about that back and forth, that go um, between the greater spiritual truth, the other, and the self. I think letting everything in is really good advice for life as well as writing, to just let it all in. I think someone like Ellen Bass does a really good job of this, that the messiness of life, it belongs there right alongside, the beauty of life, the awe, the deeply spiritual and sacred. I think blending those things, allowing them to be interwoven in poetry and just in the way we live, leads to a more present and fuller life as well. Um, See, someone says the way that I read my poems reminds me or sounds like Billy Collins. Was he a big influence on you? I had no idea that I sounded like Billy Collins, but I welcome the comparison. He actually has been an influence. I would not say that he's been a big influence. I enjoyed his poetry, really came to know him when he was poet laureate years ago, and really enjoy hearing him read poetry because I think he is good at it, and he kind of goes slowly enough so that you pick it up all together at once. But he's a great one to turn to. I think when I can get overly complicated in my head about poetry, I go back sometimes and I'll read Billy Collins like, oh, yes, shoveling snow with the Buddha. Talk about going between the larger universal and the mundane, shoveling snow with the Buddha. He has a great poem by that same title. And yeah, I want to thank all of you for being with me today. So many of you stuck with me, even though Mark wasn't here, and I really appreciate that. I just want to send you off. This kind of goes along with Lana's question, and is really gets to my basic core belief that everything really is spiritual, and everything, it has potential to be part of a poem, to be written about as well. And actually, when Mark and I thought we were going to be reading together today, he asked me to read this poem, so I will obey his wishes and share it with you. So this is called Spiritual. It all counts as practice. The way you stack clean dishes in the drainer so they won't break. How you wipe down the counter and fold the towels. How you talk to a coworker or your husband after a hard day, saying to him, "You can lay your head in my lap." Then spending the rest of the evening rubbing his temples to release the pain locked inside. And isn't this as sacred an act as bowing to a statue of the Buddha, or standing in line for hours just to touch the worn bronze toe of St. Peter in Rome, believing that a single gesture might bless the rest of your life? So many blessings to all of you out there, in the small, in the mundane, in writing, if you are a writer, or whatever you do for the rest of your day. Sending many blessings to all of you. Gratitude for sharing this time and space with me. I so love hearing other people talk more than myself, but it has been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed sharing these poems. So thank you so much for being with me, and take good care, everyone. Bye bye now.